Hello, everyone, and welcome to Probing New Public Opinion Data for an Informed Response. This is the fifth installment in a series of Zoom forums where we at MassINC and the MassINC Polling Group examine COVID-19 public opinion research on distinct policy areas and explore potential policies that address the impacts of the pandemic. Last time, we looked into data on how the crisis impacted small businesses and businesses owned by women and people of color. Thank you to those who were present then and to those who are joining us now. In each of our forums, the data has been clear that the burdens of the pandemic are falling heaviest on our most marginalized communities, whether it's on their health, housing, finances, or the quality of education their children are receiving. Today, we dig deeper into the theme and examine the weight of the crisis on the Massachusetts Latino community. We'll take a look at the results of a survey that asked Latino residents about their experiences in a variety of issues, including voting, the census, impacts of COVID-19, remote learning experiences, and the pandemic's impact on family financial security. We'll follow that up with a conversation on the short-term and long-term policy implications that could help serve and meet the needs of the Latino community and bring about much-needed recovery. We look forward to your participation, as always. So along the way, as you're listening, please be sure to make use of the chat function on the Zoom chat and share your questions as they arise. They may either get answered in the chat by MassINC Polling Research Director, Maeve Dugan, or they may be answered by our speakers during our question and answer portion at the end. Before we jump into the presentation, I first want to extend a huge and profound thank you to the sponsors of the poll. Thank you to Amplify Latinx for being such a relentless partner, the Barr Foundation, the Latino Legacy Fund at the Boston Foundation, EOS Foundation, Blue Cross Blue Shield of Massachusetts, and the Greater Boston Latino Network. We also want to take the time to thank our distributing partners, El Gaston Institute and Barrales Law. With your support and relentless ongoing work on this poll, we were able to make it a success. And now, we are going to dive into the results of the poll with a presentation led by Steve Gazella, president of the MassINC Polling Group. Steve, take it away for us.
Thank you, Juana, and thank you all for being here this morning. It's looking through the names, it's encouraging to see and a bit of happiness to see so many good friends who are here. What we're going to be talking about today is a poll that we conducted among the Massachusetts Latino population, and I'm just going to go ahead then and share my screen so that you all can see the slides that we're going to be going through. We do have a lot to get through, so I'm going to be going through them fairly quickly, but all of the results, all the crosstabs, top lines, the slides, and even the video of this presentation will be available at massincpolling.com. All the results are actually posted already, and this video will be posted as soon as the event is complete. So if you need to go back and catch anything, just go on over there, and that's where you can find all the results that we're talking about today. So what is this that we're talking about? What is this actual survey that is the basis for all of these slides? This is a survey of 622 Latino residents in Massachusetts. This is one that was conducted both by phone and online, and was done, of course, in a bilingual fashion. The idea, of course, of both of these, of both of those, is to just maximize the number of people who are able to participate and expand the coverage to as broad as possible, broad as we could. We weighted the data to represent the Latino population of Massachusetts, and you can see there the range of factors that we considered when ensuring that our data was representative of the Latino population of Massachusetts. So that's what we're talking about here. The other thing that you'll see as we go through this is some of the other surveys that we've talked about at previous Zoom forums like this. So since the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic, we have been doing surveys kind of along these same lines, where we've been trying to examine the policy impacts on specific issues and in specific areas. And some of the things that we've looked at in past surveys also came up very clearly in this survey, but we'd already done something more detailed in the past. So think, for instance, economic issues, think small business, think education. We couldn't cover each one of those issues in enormous detail in this poll. So when something came up in this poll that we wanted to look at in more detail, in some cases we referenced polls that we've done in the past. And we made notes on each one of the slides where we use some other source other than the survey that we're talking about today. All right, so in terms of topics, we're looking at a few different things. Of course, voting is something that's on everybody's minds right now. The presidential election is ongoing, and how people vote and the barriers to participation is something that's certainly on a lot of people's minds. The 2020 census, of course, is something which is an ongoing issue. COVID, obviously, the impact of COVID is something that the survey took a pretty deep look at. Then what issues are of greatest urgency? And we asked that a couple different ways, which provided some interesting kind of insight and nuance. We looked a little bit at education, mostly looking backwards at last year, but then a little bit looking ahead to next year, and then economics, of course, the shape of both individual economic challenges, and then also a little bit on small businesses and the impacts on Latino small business owners specifically. So starting off with voting then, what this one shows is barriers to participation in voting. So the question that you're seeing here was, all the questions are shown at the bottom of the slides, but basically it's the percent of people who say that they have experienced this barrier to participation. So the first line here is the percent of overall Latino residents in Massachusetts who say that they have encountered the barrier of not being able to get time off work, 20% overall. They didn't know where and when to vote was 18%. You can kind of see, you can see then the other two were a little bit less frequent, with language barriers being the least frequent barrier that people said had occurred. But then the other interesting thing about this chart is that if you look between age groups, the group that describes the most barriers is the youngest voters. So basically among 18 to 29-year-old registered Latino voters, you see 29% say getting time off work has been a barrier to participation in the past. 27% said not knowing where and when to vote, and 24% said that the polling location was inconvenient. Then you kind of scan down the age groups, just going down the chart, and you can see that each one of those barriers becomes less of a big deal for as you climb up the age ladder. This will be one that I hope we'll have the opportunity to re-examine after this election, just because, of course, with so many voters planning to vote by mail in this contest, these are some that could potentially shift around a little bit in this upcoming election. We just released a poll this morning with WBUR that found overall the voters who say that they're planning to participate, 41% of them say that they're planning to vote by mail, and there's a big skew toward Democrats as far as people who are planning to vote by mail. So what exactly the impact will be on this slide is uncertain, but certainly something to keep an eye on. How that's played out in past elections, though, is basically that Latino residents overall are less likely to participate than all registered voters. This is based on analysis from the state voter file of people who turned out in 2016. And then within that, the youngest Latino voters are still less likely to turn out even than that. So 40% of Latino voters who are under the age of 30 turned out in 2016 to cast a ballot. So again, whether the change in barriers makes a difference this time, this is the starting point. This is the difference in participation based on age among Latino voters last time. This kind of underscores a point that we make a lot, which is that if the voting population ever looked like those who are eligible to vote, like if everybody turned out to vote, results would be dramatically different than they are, hugely different than they are. But it just has not happened. Young people overall, and particularly people of color, have traditionally been less likely to participate, even in higher turnout elections in Massachusetts. So then who, if each one of these voters turned out, who would they actually cast their ballot for? And you see that among Latino voters in Massachusetts, Joe Biden would lead 59% to 16%, 25% saying that they're that they'd vote for someone else, or they're still undecided at this point. Now this poll was among registered voters, so a lot of the gray bar out there is actually people who just wouldn't cast a ballot at all in many cases, and that gray bar is actually even probably a bit larger than that. And you can see that impact when you look down again at the youngest voters, and you see Joe Biden still leads, but that gray bar is much larger. And again, even more than that would actually have not cast a ballot in the past. So we'll see how that turns out this year. And then of course there's a very significant gender gap, which is another thing that we see in the general population and shows up among Latino voters as well. Okay, so turning away from voting and onto another big 2020 issue, of course, we're talking about census participation. This poll was taken last month, so these numbers have probably moved somewhat, but as of last month, 62% of participants in the poll said that they had also completed the 2020 census. And then what the chart shows is the percent of each one of these different groups who say that they have completed the census as of now. And there's some interesting groups at the top and at the bottom that I think underscore the challenge going forward. The biggest one, just like it is with voting, is age. You see at the top, you've got Latino residents over 60. 78% of them say they've already completed the census at this point. Down at the bottom, you see that number is 45% among voters who are, among Latino residents who are under the age of 30. The other interesting group there at the bottom is those not registered to vote. That's a whole bunch of different reasons that people aren't registered to vote. You know, some of course has to do with citizenship status, some has to do with just a choice or not to register to vote or other kinds of factors. We did not ask about immigration status in this poll. We made the decision in consultation with the partners on this poll and on other recent polls that the sensitivity of the issue these days and in this political climate doesn't allow us to ask that question. So unfortunately, it's by no means a perfect proxy, again, because there's lots of reasons that you might not be registered to vote, but you can read into the fact that number is down there at the bottom, that immigration status is also very likely to play a major role in decisions or plans as to participate, whether to participate in the 2020 census. But what the chart shows overall is just, if there is an undercount, who is most at risk of being undercounted? That's what this slide here really shows. Okay, so then turning to key issues. This was another thing that the poll dug into at some length. And we asked it two different ways. We asked, on an open-ended basis, what would you say the most important issue is for the state legislature to address? And then people could enter whatever they wanted, and we would group the responses into different categories. And when we did that, we found education at the top, jobs in the economy, and COVID-19. So no big surprises as far as what the top three were. Seeing Black Lives Matter there at number 4 was quite interesting. And we have, in a little bit, we also just asked about support for the Black Lives Matter movement. And then we're also able to compare that with voters as a whole statewide and also nationally. I'm sorry, residents as a whole. I keep saying voters. We also asked the priority question just where you could pick. You could say whether an issue is a high, medium, or low priority. And we wrote the issues. And you can see that when we did that, we see 2 of the top 3 are still the same. We see jobs and unemployment up there. We see high quality education and healthcare. Jobs, education, and healthcare are 3 that we very often in polling over the years have seen right up there in the top 3. But then the other one, Black Lives Matter, we didn't write it specifically like that, but improving race relations, you see down, still in the top group, sort of your 70 plus, but not quite as high, not quite as near the top as it was when we asked about it on an open-ended basis. Then reforming police funding and practices, we had at 59% of people calling it a high priority. So still a majority there. Some other things which we've seen in polling, I think, show up on this chart as well, which is that issues that had been further up, like transportation, have dropped somewhat due to the pandemic. People are focused on other things. Transportation is not as much of a challenge these days since so many fewer people are driving, so many people are taking the MBTA and so forth, that the priority that people assign to public transportation has fallen somewhat. And climate change is another one where we've seen a bit of a decline across a lot of different polling. So then looking at the Black Lives Matter the support numbers, we see that the vast majority, 80%, say that they strongly or somewhat support the Black Lives Matter movement. 59% offer its strong support. So again, the vast majority of Latino residents express support for the Black Lives Matter movement. We also then referred to a Suffolk University poll, which was among all residents. And we also compared it to a Pew Research Center poll to let us look at Latino residents in Massachusetts, all residents in Massachusetts, and then a nationally representative population. And you can see that the darkest bar there on the far left is from this poll, Latino residents in Massachusetts. And you can see that overall strong support is slightly higher among Latino residents in Massachusetts than either the state population or than the national population. And when you combine strongly and somewhat, it's still somewhat higher than the national, than the overall national figure. So really interesting numbers there, I thought, to take a look at. So then turning some to education. Education was identified as the top issue on the open-ended priority question, and one of the top issues when we're looking at the closed-ended question. And we didn't dig into it a whole ton in this poll just because we had just done an education poll. So I went back to that. We went back to that poll and pulled out some of the most interesting things that I think kind of highlight what the challenges that Latino parents specifically faced during last school year. So this is a survey of K-12 parents. And the thing that we're looking at here is the percent who were basically not connected with online classrooms. The percent in each demographic group who connected either less than once a week, not at all, didn't know, it didn't apply, that sort of thing. And what we see at the top, the two groups that were the most likely to say that applied to them were people who did not have English spoken at home, people who had insufficient devices. You can see Spanish at home is also, that's the fourth there on the list. And that this set of things is something we saw come up over and over and over again in the education poll. The things that were limiting students' ability to participate were language barriers and technology barriers. There were other things too. There was income. Income certainly played a role, and there are other factors as well. But as far as things that I think just were probably the most common in terms of barriers to parents' participation and describing how their children were able to participate, language and technology just came up over and over and over again. So this is another way to look at the language barrier. And what the numbers are here are the percent who said that their child participated in each one of these things at least a few times a week. And it's broken out by the dark red bar, families that have English spoken in the household, and the pinkish sort of bar is families where English is not spoken at home frequently. And you can see that there's huge differences in participation levels. So looking at the middle one, which is the same concept we were looking at in the previous slide, 72% of families where English was spoken at home said that their kids participated in an online classroom at least a few times a week, compared to 54% where English was not spoken at home. And you can see that personalized feedback, that's the left set of bars there, the same kind of gap, about a 20-point gap in terms of frequency of participation, or in terms of the likelihood that parents were participating in this at least a few times a week. So certainly language barriers were a big issue. We also saw things like whether materials were offered in multiple languages was something where, that was a potential limitation. But again, this is just something, language and technology just came up over and over and over again. In that poll, which is not what we're looking at in this slide, but in that poll, we also asked about return to instruction. And I didn't include our slides from that poll because the poll was taken in June. And what we've seen is that numbers are changing. They're changing even week to week. Just think about even the last few weeks. We've gotten, a lot of school districts have released their plans. They've released their 3 different plans for hybrid, fully online, fully in person. Some school districts have decided to go all remote. It's become a national political football with, both sides kind of weighing in on whether or not public schools should reopen. So numbers are changing. So instead of looking at our old data, I pulled some national numbers from a Washington Post poll, which was done at the end of July, to show a similar dynamic to what our poll found in June, which is that there are quite significant differences in terms of what people would prefer. Basically, what we're looking at here is the red portion of the bar is the percent of each group who say that they would like to see all in-person instruction. The pinkish is a mix, and the blue is all online. And you can see that white parents particularly were less likely to say that they would prefer all online, whereas when you look at Latino parents, you see 51% say that they would prefer it all online. And which direction these numbers will shift going forward, we can't say for sure, but they have been shifting overall more towards online, both in terms of race and ethnicity and also partisanship. That's another area where we're starting to see these widening divisions, which is certainly making life more complicated. So something to think about as the next few weeks unfold and school districts really decide what it is that they're going to do. So then another big issue that the poll covered, of course, was the impact of COVID-19. Sorry, my dog is whining right next to me, wants to get in on the presentation. Another big issue that the poll looked at was of course COVID-19. The data that we're looking at on this particular slide is the official data, just pulled straight from the official state dashboard. The reason that we wanted to look at that though was we wanted to see if what we found was kind of in line roughly with what the state found in terms of the incidence of COVID-19. Of course, the state, and we found that it was. Of course, the state data has shown that Latino residents were disproportionately impacted by the health impacts of COVID-19. We took a look at that in a little bit more detail, digging into some of the demographics within the poll. So overall, our poll found that 12% said that there had been symptoms in the household. So we looked at things, basically, have you experienced symptoms or has anyone in the household? Then did anyone try to get tested? That's the next number you see there in that chart. Then were they able to get tested, either all or just some, or were they not able to get tested? And then at the far right, we see the percent who say that someone in their household has tested positive for COVID-19. Then breaking it out a little bit, we see some kind of interesting things. So focusing in this slide on the left-hand column, here what we see is a breakout of overall essential workers and non-essential workers, and the incidence of whether they've had COVID-19 in the household or not. And you can see that 14% of essential workers say someone in their household has had COVID-19 or has had the symptoms rather, 7% non-essential. Focusing on symptoms just because particularly early on there was a lot of difficulty accessing tests, of course. But you can see that there's basically twice as many people, essential workers, say that COVID-19 had impacted them, had someone in their household had COVID-19. Then another way we looked at it was basically employment status. And here we see that a dynamic that I touched on at the top, which is that this is a compound crisis. It's a crisis which has economic elements, it's a crisis which has health elements, it has education elements, and these things are piling up on the same groups of people. It's not like one group of people is dealing with one issue, one group is dealing with another issue. People who are unemployed are more likely to have had COVID in the household. People who don't have health insurance are more likely to have had COVID in the household. With unemployment, of course, that cuts in both directions. It's both, it can also, the causation is the direction of causation is unclear, I guess is what I'm trying to say. If you've got someone that you need to care for, if someone in your household gets COVID and you have to quarantine, all these things can, of course, also impact your employment status and can certainly cause additional economic issues as well. Another way that it's a compound crisis then is in terms of mental health. So what this slide looks at is the percent who said that they have felt more sad, anxious, or depressed than normal over the past few months. So overall, the number is 51%, which is quite alarming on its own. Half of people say that they've been more sad, anxious, or depressed than normal over the past few months. But then looking at households where someone in the household has had symptoms, that number climbs to 70%. Looking at unemployed people, that number climbs to 63%. So again, you've got the health crisis, the employment crisis, and the mental health crisis kind of all coming together in one, which is, again, I think just illustrates the compound nature of the crisis that COVID is really creating. So then digging in a bit more on the economics of it, what this one looks at, this is from a housing poll that we did, and we were looking at the percent of each group that fell into one of the categories of higher economic levels of distress. And we were looking at missed housing payments, food insecurity, lost pay, and job losses, and found that there are big differences by income, big differences by education. Renters were much more likely to have experienced economic distress. And then Latino and Black residents particularly were way more likely to have experienced economic distress than were Asian and white residents. So again, just a way that this is a crisis which is not evenly distributed in the population of Massachusetts. So one of the reasons one of the impacts that the crisis has had is that it's sent a lot of people home, working from home, basically. But what this poll and others have found is that the opportunity to work from home is not equally distributed. People in upper income categories and people with greater levels of education typically have been able to work from home more. We've seen that in many of our polls that we've conducted, including this one here. And then if you're interested, take a look at the WBUR poll that'll come out the rest of it will come out the next day or two and kind of looks at a similar dynamic. But that's inverse to whether you've lost your job. So there's basically a couple different things that could have happened. You could be working remotely. You could be an essential worker or still having to go into work and expose yourself to potential impacts of COVID-19, or you could have lost your job. And again, those three, that set of trade-offs is not equally distributed among the population. So looking at some of the other economic impacts, then some of them are slightly more even. Not all of them. Getting food from a food bank, we see almost half of Latino households under $50,000 say that they've gotten food from a food bank since this began. But looking at lost savings, that's something that's impacted everybody. It doesn't matter how much money you have. People have lost a lot of it during this period to the extent that they had any savings to begin with. And then missing rent or mortgage, we see fewer households over $100,000, but about 20% saying that at the other income categories, saying that they've missed rent or mortgages. So one final thing then, I grabbed a couple slides from the small business survey that we just released. I should also note that all of the surveys that I'm touching on that are not this one are also at massincpolling.com. So if you're interested in looking at much more depth on this survey or any other, I'd encourage you to head over there. I pulled them because I wanted to also just offer some notes on Latino small business owners, just because the impacts there have also been quite significant. So what this first slide shows is basically the size of the business broken out by race and ethnicity. Then you see men versus women business owners and women of color there at the bottom. And it's broken, the slide shows basically last year's revenue. How big of a business are we talking about? And you can see that Latino and Black owned businesses are more likely to be in either the under 100,000 or 100,000 to $500,000 categories. The reason that matters, if you do take a look at the full slide presentation, is because the impacts on the smallest businesses, the micro businesses, have been much more significant. They're more likely to have lost revenue. They're more likely to still be closed. They're less likely to have been helped by PPP loans. They're more likely to be in sectors that rely on customers coming through the door, which is obviously a big issue these days. So just something to keep in mind as far as the size of businesses and what it means when the smallest businesses have been impacted. So then looking at PPP loans for just a second, what this slide shows is whether or not your business applied for a PPP loan. And you can see that there are some levels of disparities between white-owned businesses and businesses owned by people of color, with 64% of Latino-owned businesses saying that they have applied for a PPP loan. But when you combine that with then, okay, well, what happened if you applied for a PPP loan? The disparity gets a little bit larger still. So the dark blue portion of the bar is your business was approved for the full amount that it applied for. Lighter blue is, okay, you were approved, but you got a smaller amount. Red is you were denied. And the gray is that the status of your PPP loan remains uncertain. So basically, when you combine the 71% here with the slightly lower percentages on the last slide, the gap grows somewhat as far as the effectiveness of the PPP loan program for businesses owned by people of color. What this slide then shows, which I think is the last one that we have, is missed payments. So we asked about whether you've missed payments for things like insurance, taxes, rent was a big one. Whether you've missed vendor payments or not, and you see that that businesses owned by people of color were more likely to say that that is the situation that they're in. The full set of slides also shows the types of businesses that this has impacted, and the kind of alarming note about it is that the businesses that are most likely to say that this has happened to them are your Main Street businesses. It's your restaurants, it's your beauty salons, it's your barbershops, it's your, little mom and pop retail shops and so forth. So something to consider is just the impact on Main Streets as this continues, if rent payments and other payments continue to struggle. So that is a very quick tour through what is a very long poll. And I'm now going to hand it back to Juana to introduce our next speaker.
Thank you so much, Steve, for your presentation and data. I've been from the very beginning of starting this project so excited for this work. A lot of the time our policy is driven by people who are power brokers, and those who are most disempowered aren't part of the process. So I commend Amplify Latinx for taking on this initiative and really trying to get an assessment of where Latinos are across our state to then help inform an agenda that speaks to the needs of their greatest challenges. But without further ado, I want to yield the floor to our research director at MassINC, Ben Foreman, who's put together a presentation that speaks to the data you just presented to a certain extent, because like you said, this poll that you conducted is probably the most extensive in terms of policy assessment that we've done thus far. So without further ado, Ben, take it away for us.
Thanks, Juana. Steve raises all kinds of issues and policy questions. I want to cover 3 topics today that are areas where MassINC policy research has actually done quite a bit of work in the last few years to inform our conversation. Elected representation, that was a big issue around voting. Black Lives Matter and criminal justice reform in Massachusetts, and housing and education, which are 2 separate issues, and they relate directly to sort of economic opportunity in our Commonwealth. And a lot of MassINC's research has actually looked at the intersection of the 2. So starting with the census, we were looking at census participation rates back in April, May, even early June, following where we were compared to the 2010 census in terms of people self-responding at those different intervals. And we actually were surprised by, it looked as if our communities were doing fairly well. But when I looked at the most recent numbers this week, you actually see pretty considerable gaps in a number of our gateway cities that are predominantly or largely Latinx communities. Holyoke, was one back in April. They looked like they were doing very well, and they were far off where they were in 2010 at this point in terms of self-response. Chelsea, Lawrence, again, big gaps and real concerns that a combination of the coronavirus crisis and I think all the work this administration has done in Washington to dissuade Latinx residents to create fear in tamper participation is really having an impact. It was interesting from Steve's poll where we had 62%, I think, of Latinx respondents had completed. When you look at Massachusetts overall, we're at 65%. So across the state, it looks like we're doing fairly well, but in our gateway cities, there's great need to to urgently increase turnout before the count completes. Obviously, this has a lot to do with disparities in elected representation. We spent all of 2019 looking at this issue at the gateway city level as well as at the state level, and how the two are sort of intertwined, one and the same problem, especially as we concentrate people of color in a handful of communities, and in those communities, they are underrepresented. And these figures come from the Gaston Institute and look at elected representation on school committees and city councils. We've done this work looking at mayors and other elected offices. In every instance, you see large gaps between the share of the population who's Latinx and the share of elected leaders who are Latinx. In some cities, it's pretty extreme. I think it's largely driven by school committees, which tend to remain all at large bodies, which means the largest racial and ethnic group of people vote along racial and ethnic lines can win all the seats on the body. So you have in many of our gateway cities all white school committee members in school districts where the majority of students are students of color. So obviously that creates huge issues in terms of the people who are being served by the schools being well represented at the leadership table and involved in governance and helping to ensure that the schools are meeting the needs of the community. But it's also a larger issue in a state where we concentrate people of color in a few communities, because if they're not getting elected to local office in those communities, they're at a disadvantage when they want to compete for a state house seat or a state senate seat. And when we look at our state legislature, we see that people of color are even more underrepresented, or Latinx residents are 12% of our state's population, yet they're only 5% of our state legislators, and they're even more underrepresented in legislative leadership. When you look at the Senate's leadership team, which has 16 members, the House's leadership team, which has 16 members, and then all of the committee chairs, that's what we kind of loosely defined as the leadership structure in the legislature. And you only find 2 Latinx leaders in that group of about 70 or so people with leadership positions. So it's a real problem in this, to the extent that in Massachusetts, a lot of local decision making is constrained. The state has a lot of prerogative when it comes to revenue, when it comes to land use, when it comes to education, and all sorts of issues. We concentrate power in our state legislature more than I think most do, in part because we have a very large state legislature. So in order to deal with that unwieldy body, we leave a lot for the leadership to decide, and people of color are not represented nearly to the extent that they could or should be in our legislative leadership. We think that if your legislature as a body is unbalanced, you do, go further to see that people of color actually have more of a seat at the leadership table when you're missing so many members. But the opposite is actually occurring in Massachusetts. And we see that play out in policy issues. And I want to go now to the discussion about criminal justice reform, because this is a frequently cited statistic from the Prison Policy Initiative. When you look at the disparities between our white incarceration rate in Massachusetts and our Latinx incarceration rate, it's more than 4 to 1, 4 times more likely to be incarcerated if you're Latinx in Massachusetts. And that's the highest Latinx to white disparity in the entire country. No other state has disparities that high. I actually just did these numbers last month, looking at what the true incarceration rate is, because when the Prison Policy Initiative did this, they only looked at state departments of corrections, so they didn't include folks from the state who are incarcerated in federal correctional facilities or county correctional facilities. So you're missing half the problem there. Our Latinx incarceration rate at last count was 765 per 100,000 residents. So, just to give you a sense of what that looks like, there's no European country that has an incarceration rate over 100 per 100,000. So if this were a COVID-19 incidence map, we would be bright red. There's no way that's healthy. And we've been working on criminal justice reform issues for almost a decade now, alongside a small community of people who care deeply about this problem. But it's always bothered me that it's not all hands on board when it comes to criminal justice reform, because this is definitely impacting our gateway cities, our communities of color. It's using an enormous amount of resources in a very unproductive way. It's tearing families apart. It's disconnecting people from economic opportunity. It's limiting the dollars we have to invest in our community colleges, and our workforce training systems, and transportation. Every way you look at it, it's a bad policy choice. It's a policy choice there's no way we would be making if more people of color and affected communities have a seat at the table. And I think the Black Lives Matter is just the very beginning of the conversation. We've seen in the police reform bill that the Black and Latino caucus led these last few months. And as we start to think about how we divest, reinvest, where the opportunities are, there's huge promise to do much, much better for our gateway cities and our communities of color. And I think if everybody gets engaged in this conversation, we will make a tremendous difference here. So turning now to the issue of housing and education, and again, I said those two things are intertwined. This trend is something that we've been looking at for a long time. People who are buying homes in Massachusetts who are Latinx residents are increasingly buying, overwhelmingly buying even in our gateway cities. Some of this has been the prices in Boston, which has traditionally had a large Latinx communities in neighborhoods like Jamaica Plain, has just become too unaffordable. So you've seen the blue line at the bottom is the share of all Massachusetts Latinx home buyers who purchased in Boston, and it fell from 8% to 3%, according to the most recent data we have, which only go through 2017. But you can see over this period, this 10-year period, the number purchasing in gateway cities rose from 48% to 60%. So 6 out of 10 people who are Latinx who purchase a home purchase in one of the state's gateway cities. Obviously, home buying is really tied to building intergenerational wealth. Where you can purchase and whether your asset appreciates is largely going to determine whether you have resources to retire and to pass down to family members. And there's real reasons to be concerned about the people who have purchased in gateway cities recently, particularly in the neighborhoods where they have purchased. When you look at sort of the stability of neighborhoods, we use an index that's based on the poverty rate of the neighborhood, the amount of residential churn in the neighborhood, how many people are coming and going every year, and how many vacant and abandoned homes there are in the neighborhood. Almost a third of Latinx residents over this 10-year period purchased in the most unstable neighborhoods in Massachusetts. So they were almost 3 times more likely than white residents to be buying in a neighborhood that was at real and serious risk of decline. And there's no question that the crisis now is going to precipitate neighborhood decline for lots of reasons. One, if your home values are tied to your schools. If we can't fund our schools appropriately, home values are going to decline. Your home values are tied to neighborhood businesses. If the barber shop isn't there, if the corner store is not there, other kind of amenities that make the neighborhood an attractive place to live, your home values are declining. We saw from Steve's poll numbers the trouble that a number of our businesses owned by people of color have had accessing supports to stay alive through this crisis. And we're really worried about the impact that will have on property values. So the next set of slides kind of look at the concentration of poverty in our gateway city schools, which is another big issue relating to kind of residential segregation and the trend we've seen. We started kind of looking at these numbers in the early 90s going forward, and every year there was an increase in school poverty in gateway cities without fail. It's a little hard to track most recent years because we moved from a low-income student measure to an economically disadvantaged student measure. But you can see here, by that economically disadvantaged student measure, almost all of the students in our gateway city schools attend school where more than 40% of the students are poor. And the literature on this is really clear. There's lots of academic research that shows if you attend a high poverty school, you're less likely to reach your full potential than if you had attended a school where students with high needs weren't so heavily concentrated. When you look across Massachusetts, nearly 3/4 of Latinx students now attend high poverty schools, which is just astounding. The level of segregation by need there is hugely problematic. And we as a state do not have any sort of policy to counter this. We haven't really addressed these numbers, drawn attention to them. And ever since busing, I think there's been a real reluctance to talk about school segregation, but without question, it's highly problematic, especially when we don't fund the schools in our high-need communities to the extent that we need to, which has been the case for over a decade. I just want to show some data in terms of progress students are making towards earning college degrees. I think increasingly we know that post-secondary education is critical for success in the Massachusetts economy. We've built one of the world's premier knowledge economies. That means we need advanced training to secure a job that's going to provide families sustaining wages in this state. And yet we haven't really lived up to that in terms of our educational system providing the opportunity students need to get that education training. So these come from a report that came out in June from some researchers at Brown University. These are figures for Latinx students by the year they took the MCAS, so the year they were in 10th grade. And they tell us how many went to college, how many graduated high school, and how many earned a 2-year or 4-year college degree, 7 years after the date they took the MCAS. So you can see here that we've boosted high school graduation rates over the last decade or two with our reform work by 20 percentage points. We boosted folks who were graduating high school and going on to attend college by 20 percentage points. So 60% of Latinx students finish high school and go on to college now. But where we didn't make much progress was in community college graduation, the 2-year figure, and more progress, but still not all that much in 4-year graduation rate. So about 15% of Latinx students from the 2011 cohort of MCAS test takers earned either a 2- or 4-year degree, which was less than half the rate of white students in Massachusetts. Huge disparity there. And you can even see, if you look at the orange line, the percent who are attending college after high school has declined, definitely stalled out. And I think that's really a symptom of, a lot of folks went, but they didn't graduate. And that signal has come through. Over this period, again, we reduced investment in K-12, but we significantly reduced investment in our community college system and our public higher education system at a time when prices and pressures on Massachusetts families were rising and made it much harder to pay the tuition. Students had to work a lot more to help their families pay the rent. And the impacts on college completion, people fulfilling their goals and earning the credentials they need to succeed in their economy are really evident. One of the things I think is disappointing is the same Brown study show, if you just look at low-income students versus non-low-income students, based on their MCAS score and their earnings, if they graduate from a 4-year of college, there is no gap, a very small gap. And actually, if you look at the text of the study, they say for Latinx students, the gap goes away completely. There's some gap left for Black students. But this shows that higher education really can lift all boats. If we can get students through high school through to a 4-year degree and into the labor force, they're going to enjoy the same success as their more affluent peers. So the challenge for us is really making higher education accessible and making sure that our Latinx students are able to complete. We have a whole set of interventions that we know can make the difference and move the needle there. And what we need to do is really not take a half-hearted approach, but be aggressive and ambitious about implementing them. The one example of where we really are doing that, and we've talked about this a lot at MassINC, is early college. There's over 3,000 students, I think, this fall that are going to be participating in early college programs in Massachusetts at over 30 high schools. More than half of these students are Latinx. This is really serving first-generation low-income students. And from all the evidence we've seen in other states and early evidence in Massachusetts, this intervention is likely to double the chances of them completing a post-secondary degree. Early college basically allows students to earn a whole bunch of credits while they're in high school for free. So they're able to preserve a lot of their federal financial aid for later. It also gives them all kinds of intensive advising and support. So students are getting exposure to the world of college, which they may not be able to draw on friends and family for advice and support while they're in high school. And so when they go off on their own, they're much better prepared to navigate all the challenges that come their way. So just to kind of wrap up and have a conversation with the audience and Juana, in terms of short-term policy opportunities to respond to a lot of these problems, the economic development bill that the Conference Committee is looking at, and hopefully the governor will be signing soon, includes a new neighborhood stabilization program. So for the first time, Massachusetts will have state supports to offer communities in a targeted way to help neighborhoods where Latinx buyers have purchased homes that may be at risk of decline. It'll allow them to purchase any abandoned or vacant properties that are problems for the neighborhood, repair them, return them to productive use. And also help in a coordinated way to ensure that any neighborhood problems that exist, any challenges, people are able to respond proactively and keep the neighborhood stable. On the criminal justice reform front, obviously the state did a lot of work in 2018. There's a lot that remains to be done, but we feel pretty strongly that work can't be done unless we know what the system is doing, how it's operating. And it's been very opaque. We have very little data that tell us who's in prison, what their race and ethnicity is, why they're there, what sorts of supports they get, how they're returned to communities in a safe and effective way, how our programs are working that are seeking to divert people from prison altogether, so that they don't have that exposure, and we're able to support them and make sure that they're successful. All that's work, all that reinvestment that we want to see is all contingent on having good, solid information. Again, there's some money in IT bill that the legislature just passed to build integrated criminal justice data systems that will help solve the gap that we have in information. And then lastly, in the short term, I think the legislature will be coming back in the fall to look at the whole and state revenues, how we plug them, if it's going to require more revenue. And for all of us that are concerned about our students, it's critical that we have a stable, sustainable funding stream to implement the Student Opportunity Act and ensure that our schools serving high-need students have all the resources they need to do the job. So then, when we come back and gear up for another legislative session, I think a lot of work is going to be done. Number one, we're going to do legislative redistricting. So there will be new districts that are drawn, an opportunity to ensure that more people of color have a seat in the legislature, but that's a very blunt instrument. I think really what we want is more systemic electoral reform. We detailed a whole bunch of ideas that research shows would be effective at increasing voter participation and increasing the number of people of color who are elected in Massachusetts. So we can talk about some of those in higher education access and completion. Again, looking at those data, seeing that Latinx students are less than twice as likely as white students to complete college in Massachusetts, seeing that if they are able to complete college, they have as much economic success and opportunity as their peers, really makes higher education a priority in terms of jobs and opportunity. And again, we know what needs to be done there. We need to find the will to do those things. So look forward to talking more about some of these policy ideas and strategies.
Ben, thank you so much for your thoughtful presentation. It's been a joy to work with you on this issue, really, because there's a lot of intersectionality between housing and education and climate and health. However, I'd like to start off with one of the points you brought up and that I got to see firsthand while I was at the State House, and that's electoral reform. It's been gratifying to see some changes locally in some of our gateway cities, with Lowell filing a lawsuit, with Haverhill talking about we need to change, as you mentioned, our charter so that our local school district seats and our city council seats are not just at large, right? And that those changes could help, create a pathway for candidates of color to consider running. In our Mass Forward report last year, we also considered some other topics, like thinking about public financing of elections. We know that people of color have greater barriers and don't necessarily have a network available to them to mount a campaign that is fully funded. There are also considerations of how your campaign funding resources can be utilized. Could they be used for a candidate's childcare needs while they're campaigning? Should they be used for housing needs while they're campaigning? I saw firsthand how in both elections, people who came from greater networks could campaign full time. That's just not the reality for our underserved population who have traditionally been marginalized by structural inequities. And so I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I have a lot of thoughts, as you know, on that one. You know, number one, I think the school committees at all at large have to go. That's just unacceptable. We've done a lot of work on sort of local education accountability. The idea that we can't wait for the state to come in and take over our schools before the community gets involved in governance, looking at student outcomes, and working hard to improve them. In order for that to happen, the people who are served by the schools have to be governing them. And all that large structure doesn't allow for that. So Lowell has taken that away. I know there's discussions in Haverhill about moving to some other form. You know, here is an area where ranked choice voting in a school committee or city council level is actually the optimal situation, because it would allow each group to have equal balanced representation. You wouldn't need a majority of seats to hold an office. You know, back in the day, 40 or 50 years ago, many of our gateway cities had ranked choice voting. Lowell was one of them. Worcester was one of them. At that time, we had proportional representation, but we moved away from it. And we went to the all at large structures that have created bodies that don't reflect the population at all. So I think that's one. But beyond that, I think the things we should be talking a lot about is funding. It costs money to run for elected office and provide a public service, and that's a barrier for a lot of people. The research clearly shows that cities that have adopted public financing have had more women and more people of color elected. It's sort of wouldn't take necessarily a very large investment to have modest amounts of funds for people who want to run for school committee, city council, or even state office. I think that's really important. The other thing I think we should talk about is lowering the age of voting in municipal elections, or allowing immigrants who aren't citizens to vote in municipal elections. There's absolutely no reason at all that a community who wants to give voice to its residents should be preempted by the state. And there's a number of cities in Massachusetts that passed initiatives to lower their voting age in municipal elections, and they're awaiting approval from the state in order to do so. I know Representative Andy Vargas had filed a bill that would allow any community that lowered its voting age to be able to do so. I mean, there's two things that does. It makes the electorate more balanced, because younger people tend to be more people of color in our gateway cities, but it also allows people to develop the voting habit. There's a lot of research that shows if you vote while you're younger, while you're still in high school, you're likely to continue voting later on. And then the last thing, you know, we looked at and have talked about is consolidation of municipal elections. You know, Steve mentioned in his presentation that younger people, people of color, don't vote as much in high turnout elections in presidential years, but they vote even less, significantly less, in all these primaries and special elections that we have. In many communities, people are voting 3-4 times a year. That's just not workable. People who are working 2 jobs and trying to take care of kids don't have the time to study the issues at hand and go out and vote 3 or 4 times a year. There's a lot of evidence that shows the less frequent elections mean that every time there's election, it's a bigger to-do. Grassroots organizations have the time to kind of gather up resources, turn people out, educate them. So if we had fewer elections, we'd have a lot of savings. It costs money every time we have to bring people to the polls. We could take those savings, invest them in public funding or other important things, and we get much higher turnout, much less skewed electorate. So I think there's many things that we know will work, would work, that we could and should do to ensure that our elected representatives reflect our residents.
Could not agree more with you, Ben, on a lot of the recommendations you give. I also am aware that currently the policing reform bill has an amendment to create a Latino commission and a Black commission that would help inform both the Senate and the House. And I wonder, you know, when you were talking about representativeness in the State House and the lack of Latinos demonstrating our demographics in the state, it's much less when you get into who is a part of the power structure, the 16 people who are part of the leadership team. And I wonder if it could be mandated or regulated that there needs to be some representation of people of color on that leadership team, irregardless of anything. Like, you need to ensure that if there are 12 Latino elected officials in the state house, a certain percentage of them are part of the leadership team. So food for thought on a lot of things we could be doing and implementing in our state to get to greater representativeness.
Well, I think that's right, Juan. I just think, one, I think obviously they're much more on notice now that people are paying attention, and we're looking at our people of color on boards and so forth. It'd be really hard to imagine that they would put out a leadership team that has no diversity on it again, but I think we got to be vigilant about that. But I think people should also remember that we had public financing in Massachusetts. The voters went to the polls to approve public financing of campaigns, and they backed that by more than 2-to-1 majority, and the legislature took it apart because they didn't want the competition. And so a lot of conversations are different now, that there's awareness of the problems around structural racism. And this is one that ought to be had again. The people of color wanted public financing. The legislature didn't want them to have them. And yet we have a legislature that doesn't look representative of our people, in part because we do not have public financing. So I think that is a question next session that ought to come back up. And we could really make some gains there.
Could not agree with you more. And I just had to add another statement before we get to the questions that all of our audience have shared with us. But you were mentioning criminal justice reform, and I say this time and time again, in the 2018 CJ bill, we mandated that we collect data and that the data be public. And I think that I'm outraged, and everyone else should be outraged, that we still have not seen our state make any moves on this issue. So clearly, we expect our residents to follow the law, we implement a law, and then we fail to actually comply with that law ourselves. So I think there's a lot more we need to be doing. We need to see, what happens once policing ends and you enter a criminal justice system and the court system. Are you being treated differently because of your class, your race, and your social standing? And if that's the case, the only way we can get to that information is by collecting the data, making sure that Massachusetts is holding itself accountable, investing in the resource that would allow us to put this system in structure. And we haven't done that yet. So a lot of food for thought. I know we're both committed to this issue, but I think we really need to be outraged at the fact that it hasn't happened, and we're in 2020 and this bill was passed in 2018. And I think we need to look at criminal justice, not just, in terms of like, where are we investing money, but it starts in policing, what's happening in our court system, and then does our budget really reflect the investments we need to really give people of color a path towards reintegration and successful reintegration into our communities. So just food for thought. I know you and I can talk about these issues nonstop for hours, but now I want to get to the questions from our audience. And our first question is from Jorge Ballesteros. Do we know how the statistics on barriers to voting compare to the non-Latinx population? Curious about which impacts are most unique. Steve, is that something?
Sure. I mean, that's a great question. We did not survey that specific issue in any of the general population polls that we've done. I mean, I'd say that it's certainly something that there are many polls that address, in a much more systematic fashion. If you're looking one particularly of young people, I recommend the work of John Della Volpe from the Harvard Institute of Politics. He does great polls of young people, why they vote, why, what the barriers are to voting, what the main issues are, and that sort of thing. So we did not address it specifically in this poll, but that is one that you could look at for more information on that issue. Oh, you're on mute, Juana.
I'm on mute. Sorry about that. Thank you, Steve. Ben, a question for you. Isn't the fact that Latinos are purchasing homes in gateway cities or gateway communities a good thing if they help revitalize those communities in the long run?
That's an excellent question. I'm glad you raised that because I didn't get into this. So absolutely, there's no question about that. I think one of our concerns about the future of gateway cities is actually that there'd be less immigration going forward, and we'd have less of that flow of new residents that have come to so many of our gateway cities and brought new energy and life to them. Without that, our gateway cities would be in real trouble. But at the same time, I think we want to be real and make sure that our gateway city residents get a return on their investment. We think that gateway cities have real assets and real strengths, and that should be places that appreciate. But we need, good transportation to them. If the commuter rail service is horrible, it's not going to create value for a place like Fitchburg at the end of the commuter rail line. We need tools to deal with older homes that unfortunately sometimes degrade and come apart, and then nobody wants to kind of bring them back to life, and they take away from the value of surrounding properties. Gateway cities have lost over $100 million in federal CDBG dollars a year that they used to use to revitalize blighted property. And so now a lot of properties sit for years and years, and the city just doesn't have resources to purchase it, fix it up, and put it back on the market. So this stuff is critical, and especially critical in light of housing choice, which was also in this economic development bill, which would make it easier for the suburbs to build homes that people of color or those with modest means could afford, either to purchase or to rent, which is a really good thing. We think that people ought to have the opportunity to live in suburban communities if they like. But what we don't want is that to create a flow of people out of gateway cities, further suppressing property values in gateway cities and making it so the people of color who bought in those communities don't get the return on their investment that they otherwise would. So that's why we really argued for thinking about this in a holistic way. We need to work to make sure that suburban communities do the right thing and they build more housing for people up and down the income spectrum. And at the same time, we got to make sure that our older urban communities that have some unique struggles are able to address them so that they're vibrant, vital places where people with a choice will want to remain and stay and have their families, especially when there's economic mobility, because that is one thing that we see in the Latinx population in Massachusetts. There's a high degree of economic mobility in many cases. So in many cases, within a generation or even sooner, they're moving from Chelsea to Everett to Malden to Melrose, or from Lawrence to North Andover. So, we want to see more of those families who experience economic mobility decide to stay in our gateway cities so that our gateway cities have more economic diversity.
Thank you, Ben. And just to add to that, in order, when you think about housing has so many implications. It determines the quality of schools your children are going to attend. It determines the quality of healthcare you have access to. It determines how you're able to build wealth. And I couldn't agree with you more that we need to maintain our gateway cities to be diverse, but we need to make sure that the people that make up these communities really do have access towards socioeconomic mobility, really do have access to a quality education. And as some of our data points present, we're concentrating poverty in our gateway cities as we speak. And as we speak, these families and their children aren't necessarily having access to the best quality education, to the best air or the best water. So thinking about this holistically is really important in terms of how do we strengthen gateway cities, but how do we diversify the housing stock, not to cause the diversity that currently exists in gateway cities to leave. But it's a complex issue. Now to our next question. This is from a couple of audience members, Ben and Steve. Is there any information about the age and gender of the Latinx incarceration rates that you can speak to?
Yeah, so the data I cited where I said it was 765 per 100,000. That comes from the census. And so you can take the census data and break it down a little bit more. But I think the bigger concern is obviously there's a lag on the census, and the census data doesn't give us any precision in terms of, is it county, state, or federal correctional facilities. So what we really want is that information from the state. Again, want to mention, it was required by the 2018 Criminal Justice Reform Law. The law actually says there should be a public use data file that's de-identified, that gives people access to information on people who are in the criminal justice system, allows you to break it down by age, gender, race. We're still waiting to see that information. And we know there's work the state needs to do to get it in order, but it's not that much work, and it shouldn't be this long a wait. Imagine if we were fighting the COVID-19 crisis saying, we can't get any data, we don't know where infections are occurring. We didn't have a lot of that data infrastructure, and it was built in a matter of weeks. So if this is really an urgent policy priority for Massachusetts, if we want to keep the public safe, if we want stronger, healthier communities of color, the criminal justice system needs to step up and open up access to its databases, which it has troves of data in. We spend hundreds of millions of dollars building the courts and others data infrastructure. We have a right to know what's inside there and use it for public policy purposes.
Couldn't have been better stated, Ben. Another question from Ellen. Can you explain at-large voting process and how it results in all-white school committees? Ben, do you want to take this?
Yeah, it's a good thing I'm not a math teacher because I'd be terrible at explaining concepts like this. But basically, in an all-at-large structure where it's winner takes all, whoever has the most votes wins, means that if you're voting along racial and ethnic lines, if you have a group that votes more, they can get winner take all for every single seat. So if you have 6 seats, they'll win all 6 of those seats. Whereas if you have ward-based systems, you tend to have ethnic communities within a city, so you could at least carry the seat in the neighborhoods where you live. But the proportional sort of voting, the ranked choice approach, is the best model to ensure that you have more balanced representation, because you don't have to start drawing neighborhood lines and guessing where a community is going to be, or you don't have to sort of provide an electoral incentive for people to cluster together. Wherever you are in the community, you can get a constituency of people together, whether it's a constituency of Latinx people or a constituency of people with school-age children or constituents. Any sort of voting block will have enough votes to win that, because it's based on, if there's 7 seats, you basically need about 1/7 of the vote to win that seat. You don't need a majority of the votes. So trust me, the math works, even though I can't explain it.
Yeah, and a lot of what we see in some of our gateway cities is a hybrid model where we have some at-ward seats and then some seats also reserved at large. And I know that in my time of visiting gateway cities, I've gone to gateway cities where you find at-large city council members all living within a half-a-mile radius. No representation or pulse of what's happening in other parts of our community where you can find pockets of underserved residents. So something to consider as we think about electoral reform. And we're definitely over time. I'm gonna pose one more question and we're gonna wrap this up. This is from Rosa. Did the survey ask residents for ideas to address the priority needs identified from the results of the survey? I'm trying to figure out how we implement strategies to help improve the well-being of the Latinx population.
Yeah, I mean, the place to look for that is actually in the other surveys that we've done that cover them in much more detail, that cover the issues in much more detail. So say, for instance, education, we didn't ask specifically in this poll, about a range of different things that could potentially be done. However, we asked in a poll at the end of the school year about the experience in the previous school year, and we can see what some of the barriers were and what some of the sources of disparity were and that sort of thing. So that is a place that you could look at for potential policy solutions there. On housing, we see, we did a survey on housing that showed what the shape of the disparities were that people were experiencing on housing. We see some things that have already happened, like, the extension of the rental moratorium, eviction moratorium, for instance. The survey found that it was going to be a very, very high number of residents overall, and again, not an equal number across race and ethnicity, that would be facing potential eviction, or at least be way behind on rent, as of the original eviction moratorium. So I see that my colleague Maeve Duggan is helpfully providing some links to some of the some of the other surveys that we've done on these things. Then the other place that I'd honestly suggest is that the stuff that Ben works on and the policy stuff that MassINC puts out. You know, it's not only about asking residents what the policies would be that would be helpful to them. Some of it is, it's stuff that that isn't necessarily their job to think up. So it's people like Ben and people like all the other analysts and advocates that spend all their time thinking of this stuff.
Thank you, Steve. And that is our time this afternoon. Our apologies for running late, but we wanted to make sure that we did justice to the questions that were presented. Many thanks again to our sponsors, and thank you to our wonderful presenters and team, Steve Gazella and Ben Foreman. We appreciate all of you in the audience for joining us and submitting your questions. This is one of many more forums to come in our series Probing New Public Opinion Data for an Informed Response. If you missed any of them in person, you can find the videos on our website at massinc.org or the MassINC Polling Group Facebook page. Again, thank you for taking the time to be here today, everyone. We look forward to coming together in person one day soon, but until then, be safe and well. Thank you.